we have some incredible breaking news. For you, we have some footage that has been taken on a mobile phone. For decades, tourists and national trust, rangers at the Giants' Causeway have whispered about a section of basalt cliff that slides open and closes on its own. A stone door that no geologist will explain and no official body will acknowledge. Last week, a former Irish field archaeologist named Kieran Oria walked up to that cliff alone with a drill in his hand and did what nobody has been allowed to do at this site in 60 years. He didn't go through the door. He went around it. And what his camera caught at the 12-meter mark is the part he never wanted released. And once it's been seen, it cannot be unseen. This is what he found. The man behind the drill. The Giants' Causeway on the coast of Northern Ireland is one of the UK's outstanding natural features. Its steep cliffs and deep bays form a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Giants' Causeway has stood on the North Antrim coast for 60 million years. 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, rising and falling in a stepped pattern. That's been studied, photographed, and walked across by millions of visitors. Geologists know exactly how it formed. Lava cooled, contracted, cracked into hexagons. The science is settled. There are no hidden chambers in the official record. There is nothing inside that rock that anyone has ever been able to verify. Look, which is what makes what Ora did last week so difficult to dismiss. He claims to be a former field archaeologist. According to his own account, he spent years working on subsurface surveys and structural analysis across Ireland before stepping away from the field entirely. He wasn't known for speculation. He didn't publish fringe theories, and he wasn't part of any formal investigation into the moving stone door because there wasn't one. There was only scattered footage, short clips, shaky phone recordings passed between researchers and enthusiasts who'd been quietly trading evidence for months. Most of it was dismissed almost immediately, and for understandable reasons. Basalt formations don't open. They fracture. They collapse. They weather over thousands of years. They do not move cleanly. They do not retract. They certainly do not reveal hidden spaces behind them without leaving evidence. But when Oria saw the footage, he didn't focus on the motion. He focused on what came after the edge. Not the movement itself, but the boundary where the movement had occurred. Something about it bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. It was too clean, too consistent. Any displacement of basalt, natural or otherwise, should leave microfractures. Dust, displacement, at minimum. Visible seam where one piece of stone separated from another. There was nothing. No crumbling edges, no debris on the ground, no distortion of the surrounding rock, just a clean shift. Controlled and precise, as if the stone had been engineered to move that way. He replayed the clip. He paused it. He zoomed in until the pixels broke, and the more he looked at the edge, the worse it got, because there was a word forming in his head that he didn't want to say out loud. Not movement, not fracture, not even anomaly, mechanism. And that was the thought he couldn't put back in the box. He told no one. The rocks on the shore, they're all in this hexagon shape. It's like, climbing over a giant beehive. Feels like a earthquake dragged some of the tectonic plates out of the ground some hundreds of years ago. He didn't contact a university. He didn't apply for permits. He didn't notify any of the geological survey bodies operating in the area. He arrived at the site alone, without documentation, without a crew, and without any intention of drawing attention to what he was doing. The equipment he brought wasn't unusual. The way he intended to use it was. At the center of his setup was a Hilti TE-70 rotary hammer, a professional-grade drilling system built for heavy masonry and reinforced stone. It was fitted with a 40mm carbide-tipped masonry bit, extended through a series of couplings that let him reach significant depth without widening the entry point. The whole configuration was designed to do one thing: punch through dense rock, while disturbing as little of the surface as possible. But the drill wasn't the key. The location was. Here's the catch. Ora didn't try to breach the visible face of the cliff where the reported movement occurred. That would have been too obvious, too risky. Basalt at that thickness would resist direct penetration for hours, possibly days, and any breakthrough would risk destabilizing the surrounding structure. So instead, he looked for weakness somewhere else. Basalt doesn't form as a single uniform mass. As lava cools, it contracts. That contraction creates layer densities, internal stress, variations, pockets where the stone is, fractionally less resistant than the rock around it. These differences aren't visible from the surface, but to someone trained in reading grain orientation, fracture alignment, and thermal flow direction, they can be inferred. He spent hours doing it. No digital scanners, no ground-penetrating radar, just his palms on the rock. He traced subtle variations in the stone, slight shifts in texture, minor differences in coloration, almost imperceptible changes in how the surface reflected light at different angles. Along one small zone, roughly 2 meters wide and barely 1 meter tall, the rock didn't feel like the surrounding columns. It felt thinner, less resistant, like something he wasn't supposed to find. He set the drill, adjusted the angle, and before this story goes where it's about to go, hit subscribe, because the next 60 seconds is where the official record of the Giants' Causeway stops being true. The kind of footage you're about to see is the kind other channels won't touch. Stay till the end. You'll understand why. The bit was in position. His finger was on the trigger. The moment the drill dropped, through the first layer behaved exactly as expected. Dense, unyielding. The resistance pushed back through the tool with a steady, predictable force, and the vibration pattern was consistent with solid volcanic rock. No cavities, no fractures, no anomalies. The dust expelled from the borehole matched the fine, dark particulate typical of basalt under stress. He continued, slow, measured, compensating for heat, build up as the bit fought through the stone. And get this, minutes passed, then more. Nothing changed until it did. The shift wasn't gradual. There was no warning, no softening of the resistance, no change in the pitch of the drill. One moment, the bit was cutting through solid rock. The next, it wasn't. The resistance vanished. The force required to push the drill forward disappeared so suddenly that the bit advanced several inches before he could react. The vibration through the handles changed from a dense grinding feedback to something hollow, empty open space. His finger came off the trigger. The motor wound down, and for a moment there was nothing. No machine noise, no wind off the coast, no sound from the rock face. Just his own breathing and the weight of the drill still pressed against the cliff. He didn't move. He leaned in. He turned his head so his ear was nearly against the borehole, and he listened. No airflow, no echo, no detectable movement from within. Whatever was on the other side of that rock wasn't venting to the outside. It was sealed, contained, and until this moment, completely hidden from the surface world. You have to understand what that means in geological terms. He'd been doing this work long enough to know what hitting a natural cavity inside basalt should feel like. Most natural voids inside cooled lava are small, simulacrous at most, produced by gas bubbles trapped during cooling or by the slow erosion of softer mineral inclusions over millions of years. When a drill breaks into one of those, the resistance returns within a few centimeters as the bit re-enters solid rock on the other side. That's the textbook behavior. That's what every excavation manual describes. That hadn't happened. The bit was still moving freely. Whatever space was behind the rock wasn't a bubble. It was bigger. Significantly bigger. Now stop and think about what that means. A cavity inside 60-million-year-old volcanic rock that didn't form by any process the textbooks recognize. A space the geological record says cannot exist, and it's right there. A meter behind a section of cliff that millions of tourists have walked past without ever knowing it was hollow. He pressed his palm flat against the cliff face. He let it rest there. Then he pulled the drill back slowly, just enough to confirm what had happened. There was no debris surge, no collapse, no secondary fracture, just a clean transition from solid basalt to nothing. A void exactly where there shouldn't have been one. And at that point, before he ever sent a camera through, he made a decision. Whatever was waiting on the other side of that rock, he wasn't going in after it himself. What the camera saw. He fed a tracked crawler unit through the opening. Small, low profile, sealed casing. treaded wheels, and a forward-mounted camera with LED illumination. The kind of equipment used in collapsed mine. Inspections and pipe surveys modified for a tighter clearance. He held position outside the rock, let the camera stabilize, and started the feed. For the first 30 seconds, there was nothing to look at. The crawler crept forward into darkness, the lens fogging slightly from the temperature differential between the cliff face and the air inside. Oria adjusted the brightness manually. He widened the aperture. He brought the contrast up by hand until the surfaces inside began to register. The first few meters were what you'd expect. Rough walls, dark stone, the kind of texture basalt produces when it cools unevenly. But here's what shouldn't have been there. The floor. The floor was level, not approximately level, not the kind of flatness that erosion produces over millennia. Level in a way that suggested intent, a surface that had been laid or shaped or worked at some point in the distant past. And get this, the texture of the floor didn't match the walls. The walls were raw volcanic stone, exactly the kind of texture you'd expect 10 meters into a fresh borehole. The floor was something else, smoother, darker, almost polished in places where the crawler's lights caught it at the right angle. He kept the unit moving. The corridor extended further than the lighting could reach. At roughly 12 meters in, something came into view. 12 meters is the number to remember. 12 meters is where the feed changed. 12 meters is the point where every assumption Aura had about what he was looking at stopped applying. The suspended forms, that's the best description anyone could give them based on the footage. Shapes hanging from above, distributed across the upper part of the cavity at regular, almost measured intervals. The crawler's lighting wasn't strong enough to fully illuminate them. And here's the part that doesn't make sense. The surfaces of the forms seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. Basalt doesn't do that, stone reflects. These didn't. They appeared as dark masses defined more by their outlines than by any visible surface detail. But the geometry was there, repeating, distinct. The first one came into view from a slight angle, elongated, tapered, wider at the top where it met the ceiling, and narrower toward the bottom where it ended in something the camera couldn't quite resolve. The spacing between them was uniform, not approximately uniform. Uniform. They weren't placed there by erosion. They weren't placed there by chance. Somebody put them there. And whatever they weren't completely still. The shifts were small, almost imperceptible. The kind of movement you'd miss if you weren't already looking for it. But across multiple frames, the outlines didn't stay perfectly fixed. There was a subtle drift, a barely there sway, as if something behind them or above them was producing the faintest current of air, which made no sense because the space was sealed. The crawler passed beneath the last of the suspended forms. The ceiling cleared briefly, visibility improved, then the atmosphere thickened. It wasn't visible at first as a distinct layer or boundary. It revealed itself through interference. The light from the crawler's lens started scattering more aggressively, diffusing outward in a faint haze. Edges softened. Contrast dropped. Depth of field became harder to judge. Moisture suspended in the air. Not heavy enough to drip. Not yet, but dense enough to distort the camera's perception of distance. The floor began to shift. The surface darkened in patches, absorbing more light than the surrounding stone. The crawler's tracks began leaving faint impressions as they moved forward, compressing a thin layer of something softer than rock. Shallow pooling became visible in the low areas. Thin, uneven layers of dark liquid that caught the crawler's light in broken, fractured patterns. The reflections did not form clean mirror images. They distorted, rippled slightly. Even when the crawler itself was stationary, either the liquid wasn't still or the surface beneath it wasn't stable, or both. Oria slowed the crawler. The camera angle dipped to study the ground. There was no clear flow direction, no visible source feeding the pooling. The liquid appeared to gather in shallow depressions held in place by the uneven surface. The color was difficult to define, dark, almost black under direct light. But when the angle shifted, faint variations appeared, tones that separated slightly from the surrounding basalt, which suggested it wasn't just water sitting on stone. He moved the crawler forward again, carefully. The tracks maintained traction, but not perfectly. There was a slight delay between his input and the response. A subtle slip and then the flare. It happened quickly. A burst of light brighter than the crawler's own LEDs. Not by a huge margin, but enough to stand out against the otherwise controlled illumination. It appeared ahead, just beyond the field of view. A brief expansion of brightness that reflected off the moisture in the air, creating a momentary bloom across the lens. Then it was gone. No source, no residual glow. Here's what he checked first. He checked his own equipment. He checked the LED housing for a short. He checked the camera firmware for a sensor spike. He checked the feed timestamp for a transmission glitch. Nothing. The flare wasn't on his end. It came from inside the corridor, and it lasted barely a quarter of a second. He watched it again, then a third time. It was real, and nothing in that sealed space should have been able to produce it. The lines in the stone. The camera tilted upward, and that's when he saw them. Linear structures embedded in the ceiling, not protruding, not hanging like the suspended forms behind. Integrated, running horizontally across the space, intersecting the ceiling at regular intervals. They resembled beams, subtle, partially obscured by the surrounding rock, but distinct enough to break the natural continuity of the basalt around them. Here's what stopped him cold. They didn't follow the organic fracture lines that volcanic stone always produces. They cut across them, maintaining straight paths where the rock itself would normally curve, bend, or break. Reinforcement, or at least something behaving exactly like it. And here's where it gets worse. The spacing was consistent, measured, each structure positioned at intervals that mirrored the pattern of the suspended forms earlier in the corridor. The implication was difficult to ignore. The two were connected. Whatever supported those shapes, whatever they were attached to, extended through the ceiling itself. Think about what that means. A coordinated repeating structural pattern inside rock that's supposed to be 60 million years old in a country where the earliest verified human construction is roughly 5,000 years old. The math doesn't work. Neither does the geology. The crawler kept moving. The air grew heavier. Condensation built up on the lens. Small droplets formed and merged into larger distortions that shifted with every movement. The image quality degraded, forcing Aura to rely more on motion and shape than on fine detail. And then he heard it, or rather, the microphone did. Underneath the hiss of the dampened environment, the faint mechanical whine of the tracks, the low hum that any sealed space produces, there was something else. Not a sound exactly. A pressure, a shift in the ambient frequency that the microphone barely caught. It registered as a faint compression in the audio waveform, the kind of artifact you'd normally write off as encoding noise. But when he isolated the frequency band and looped it, the same compression appeared at the same moment each time. Consistent, repeatable, not random. The kind of thing that becomes impossible to unhear after you've listened 10 times. He paused the unit, held position, waited. Nothing happened. The space ahead remained dark, unchanged. He scrubbed back through the feed in real time, isolating the frames where the flare had occurred. It was there, consistent across multiple frames. Not a glitch, not a reflection from the crawler itself. Something external, something inside the space. He resumed movement. Slowly, the ground softened further. The tracks began to struggle, not failing, but working harder to maintain forward motion. The surface beneath the thin liquid layer was giving slightly under pressure, reducing traction with each movement. The pooling deepened only by a small margin, but enough to matter. The crawler dipped slightly in certain sections. One track lost grip momentarily before correcting. The signal degraded again, this time more noticeably. Static flickered across the feed. The image distorted, then stabilized, then distorted again. The further the crawler advanced, the less stable everything became. He pushed it to approximately 20 meters in. That's where it stopped. Not by choice. The crawler lost traction. The ground beneath it could no longer support consistent forward motion. The track spun, displacing the surface layer without gaining distance. At the same time, the signal interference increased, frequent enough to risk losing the feed entirely. He held position briefly, attempted minor adjustments. Nothing improved. He tried reversing for a fraction of a second to break the slip, then re-engaging forward. Nothing. The traction was gone. The signal was deteriorating with every passing second. Every additional minute the unit stayed in place was a minute closer to losing it permanently. And in that moment, with 20 meters of corridor between him and the only piece of equipment that could see what was inside, there was no guarantee the crawler was coming back. The way out, he pulled it back slowly, carefully, retracing the same path. Now, this is where it gets unsettling. The crawler had been in there for less than 15 minutes. The cavity was sealed. There was no airflow, no external influence. Nothing should have changed inside that space between the moment the unit went in and the moment it came back through. But something had. The suspended moisture continued to distort the image, but the structure remained visible as the crawler retreated. The embedded ceiling lines passed overhead again. The darker floor gave way to the firmer, more stable surface closer to the entry point. Then the suspended forms came back into view, hanging unchanged still. But again, not completely. The same subtle inconsistencies, the same barely perceptible shifts, as if their position wasn't entirely fixed, as if they had moved fractionally during the time the crawler had been further inside, and then settled back into position by the time it returned. Frame-by-frame analysis would later confirm what Aurea suspected in real time. Two of the forms, in particular, were not in the exact same position they had been when the crawler first passed beneath them. The displacement was small, centim, maybe less, but it was there. The crawler passed beneath them, continued back until the narrow opening came into view. Light from the outside, faint and indirect, bled into the frame as the unit approached the entry point. Then it exited back into open air. Aurea didn't reinsert the crawler. He didn't attempt a second pass. He removed the equipment. He sealed the opening, not permanently, but cleanly enough that from the outside there was no visible indication that anything had been done. No fracture lines, no residual debris, no sign of drilling. The rock face appeared untouched, as if the entry point had never existed at all. And the stone door, the one that had initiated all of this, hasn't been recorded opening again since. No movement, no additional sightings, nothing. The thing that had drawn Aurea to the site in the first place has stayed completely still. Almost as if whatever was inside knows it's been seen. What's still in there? If the cavity Aurea accessed runs parallel to that section of cliff, if what he found exists alongside the structure already observed by the tourists and the rangers, then whatever is behind that stone door isn't empty. It isn't a hollow. It isn't a natural void formed by geological processes alone. It's structured, deliberate, and completely concealed within 60-million-year-old volcanic rock. There's no official record of the drilling, no documentation, no published findings, no institutional acknowledgement that any such space exists. The site sits inside a UNESCO World Heritage Zone, which means any formal investigation would take years of permits and committee approvals before a single borehole could be drilled. Aurea did it the way he did it because it was the only way it could be done at all. But the footage didn't stay private. Two credentialed geologists, one from a university in Belfast, one from a survey body whose name Aurea refuses to disclose, were quietly shown the recording. Neither has agreed to comment on the record. One reportedly watched the 12-meter sequence 3 times, then asked to see the original drill logs. He didn't ask whether they were real. He asked how far Aurea had documented the bit's resistance pattern before the breakthrough. Measured, precise. He didn't speculate beyond what he could verify. He never called it natural. There was something in there, and it wasn't supposed to be. The cliff is sealed. The door is silent. The corridor is unverified, undocumented, and inaccessible to anyone who would do it the official way. 12 meters past the rock face, suspended in a space that the geological record says cannot exist. Something is still hanging in the dark, still waiting and not entirely still. If you got this far, you're the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think Aurea saw at that 12-meter mark. Was it engineered? Was it alive? Was it something older than the rock around it? We read every comment and the best theories get pinned to the top. Hit subscribe before you leave so the next one finds you the moment it goes live.